You stop chasing. When you realize this about yourself, you are doing it right now, not chasing a person necessarily, maybe chasing a feeling, a response, a version of yourself that finally feels like enough. You are adjusting your words before you say them, measuring the distance between what you want to express and what you think will be received well. You are monitoring reactions, scanning for signs of approval or withdrawal, and somewhere in the middle of all that monitoring, you have lost the thread of who you actually are. This is not a video about romantic obsession or toxic relationships. This is about something far more quiet and far more universal. It is about the invisible current that runs beneath most of your interactions, the current that pulls you toward people, situations, and outcomes, not because you genuinely want them, but because something inside you believes you will finally feel complete once you reach them. You have probably never named it. Most people do not. They call it passion. They call it love. They call it drive. But if you slow down long enough to look at the feeling underneath, what you often find is not desire. What you find is fear. The fear that without this person, this outcome, this validation, something essential about you will remain unproven. And here is the uncomfortable part. The chasing never resolves that fear. It feeds it. Every time you get the attention you are seeking and feel relief for a moment, your nervous system learns one thing. The threat was real and the chase was necessary. So, it does it again and again. Not because you are weak, not because you are broken, but because you were trained, long before you had words for any of this, to look outside yourself for proof that you were safe, valuable, and worth staying for. The Stoic philosophers saw this pattern with striking clarity. Epictetus wrote in the Enchiridion that the root of human suffering is not circumstance, it is misplaced desire. When you direct your wanting toward things outside your control, other people's feelings, their choices, their attention, you hand your inner stability to forces that will never hold it carefully. Marcus Aurelius, writing alone in his tent during brutal military campaigns, returned again and again to a single idea in his meditations. The source of good is within you, not nearby, not dependent on who responds to you or who stays. Within. But knowing that intellectually and actually living from it are two entirely different things. This video is about the space between those two things, about why you keep chasing even when part of you knows it is not working, about what is actually happening inside you when you mold yourself to fit someone else's expectations, and about what genuinely shifts when you stop, not through willpower, not through detachment, through understanding. Because the truth is, you do not stop chasing by deciding to stop. You stop chasing when you finally see yourself clearly enough that the chase simply loses its logic. That is what we are building toward today. The moment you feel yourself trying too hard. There is a specific moment. You probably recognize it, even if you have never put words to it before. It happens mid-conversation, or in the 3 seconds between sending a message and waiting to see if it lands the way you hoped. Something shifts inside you, a subtle recalibration. You notice the other person's energy and you begin, almost automatically, to adjust yours. You soften your tone. You add something lighter to balance what felt too heavy. You pull back a strong opinion because you sense it might create distance. You laugh a little faster than the joke deserved, and while all of this is happening on the surface, something underneath is working very hard, harder than anyone around you can see. That internal effort, that constant self-monitoring and self-adjusting, is invisible to the outside world, but it is exhausting you from the inside. What makes this so difficult to address is that it does not feel like people-pleasing. It feels like awareness, it feels like emotional intelligence. You tell yourself you are just reading the room, just being considerate, just adapting. And sometimes that is true, But there is a version of adaptation that is not consideration at all. It is self-erasure dressed in socially acceptable clothing. The real tell is what happens inside you when you do it. If adapting to someone else leaves you feeling more connected and more like yourself, that is genuine flexibility. But if it leaves you feeling slightly less real, slightly more performed, slightly more distant from your own center, that is not adaptation. That is abandonment. Quiet, habitual, and almost automatic. Epictetus addressed this directly in the Enchiridion. He wrote that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about them. And one of the most persistent judgments driving this pattern is this, that being fully yourself is too risky, that the real you, unfiltered and unadjusted, might not be enough to make someone stay. So you pre-edit, you offer a curated version of yourself and call it honesty. You show up, but not entirely. And the cost is internal. Because every time you adjust yourself to secure someone else's approval, you send a message to your own nervous system. Who I actually am is not safe here. Who I actually am requires management before it can be offered. And over time, that message becomes a belief. A quiet, deeply held conviction that your unmanaged self is somehow too much or not enough, or simply unacceptable as it stands. The moment you start trying too hard is not the beginning of the problem. It is a symptom. The real question is not how to stop doing it in the moment. The real question is what belief is driving the impulse in the first place. And that belief points somewhere very specific, not toward the other person, toward you. You're not chasing them, you're escaping yourself. Here is the reframe that changes everything, and most people resist it the first time they hear it. You are not chasing that person. You are not chasing that outcome, that response, that relationship. What you are actually doing is running, and the direction you are running is away from something internal that feels unbearable to face. The mind creates a convincing story. It says, I want this person. I want their attention, their affection, their presence. And on the surface level, that is real. The wanting is real. But underneath the wanting, if you are willing to look carefully, is something that has nothing to do with them at all. There is a feeling, a quiet, persistent background hum of not quite enough, of something unresolved, of a question about your own worth that never fully gets answered. And when someone shows up who seems like they might answer it, who sees you, who chooses you, who makes the hum go quiet for a moment, the relief is enormous. That relief is what you are actually chasing, not the person, the silence, the temporary suspension of a question that has been running in the background of your life for a very long time. The question of whether you are actually enough, actually valuable, actually someone worth staying for. And because another person's attention can silence that question, even briefly, your mind learns to seek that silence outside of itself. This is the mechanism beneath almost every pattern of emotional chasing. Not desire, not love, evasion. The external pursuit is real, but it is covering something internal that has never been properly addressed. Attachment theory, developed through the foundational research of John Bowlby, describes how early relational experiences shape the templates through which we approach closeness as adults. When early attachment figures were inconsistent, present sometimes, emotionally unavailable others, the nervous system develops a specific response. It learns that closeness is not reliable, that it must be pursued, maintained through effort, earned through performance. That wiring does not disappear when you become an adult. It simply transfers to new relationships. The adult who chases attention is often the child who learned that love required effort to sustain, that if you stopped performing, stopped adjusting, stopped reaching, it might disappear. But here is the part that is hardest to accept. The reaching never fills the space it is trying to fill, because the space is not actually created by the absence of that other person. It is created by your own relationship with yourself, by the parts of yourself you have not yet been willing to sit with. Running towards someone else is a remarkably effective way of not having to stop and be alone with yourself, until you stop running. And in the silence that follows, you finally begin to understand where the emptiness actually lives, and more importantly, why it was never as permanent as it felt. The addiction to being chosen, and the contract you never signed. There is a specific emotional experience that almost no one talks about honestly, because naming it out loud requires admitting something uncomfortable about the way your self-worth actually functions. It is the feeling you get when someone chooses you, not just the warmth of connection, something more urgent than that, something that lands in the body like relief, like a tension you did not fully realize you were carrying suddenly releases, like a question you have been holding for a very long time just received its answer. When someone chooses you, something inside you rises. When they pull away, something collapses. If that pattern sounds familiar, if your sense of your own value genuinely fluctuates based on who is paying attention to you, what you are experiencing is not love. It is a reward system, and like all reward systems, it creates dependency. When we receive social approval, the brain releases dopamine, the same neurochemical involved in every other form of compulsive pursuit. And when that reward is intermittent, sometimes you receive it, sometimes you do not, the compulsion intensifies. Intermittent reinforcement does not reduce the drive, it increases it. This is why the person who is consistently available and warm does not create the same pull as the person who is unpredictable. What this means is that the intensity of the feeling, that urgent need to be chosen, is not a measure of how much you care about the other person. It is a measure of how much your sense of self depends on their response. And beneath that addiction lies something even older, an agreement you have been honoring your entire life without knowing it. The invisible contract goes something like this: if I am good enough, I will be loved. If I adjust enough, I will be kept. If I perform well enough, I will not be abandoned. No one handed you this document, but somewhere in your early experience, in the patterns of how affection was given and withheld, your nervous system drafted this agreement on your behalf, and it has been your operating system ever since. The invisible contract transforms every relationship into a negotiation. You bring your best version. You suppress the parts that feel risky. You monitor the other person's responses and adjust accordingly, all in service of a deal that was never actually agreed upon by the other party. You are holding up your end of a contract that the other person does not even know exists. And when the relationship does not unfold the way the contract promised, you do not question the contract, you question yourself. You decide that you did not perform well enough, that the terms were right, but your execution was insufficient. Research on conditional self-worth, explored by psychologist Jennifer Crocker, found that individuals who base their self-worth on external contingencies consistently experience higher levels of anxiety and relational instability. Not because their lives are objectively harder, but because they have built their inner stability on ground that shifts constantly. The contract convinced you that love is earned, but the experiences that have felt most like real love in your life were probably the ones where you felt least required to earn it. That contradiction is worth sitting with, because it points towards something the contract has been hiding from you all along. What Epictetus understood that you don't yet. Epictetus was born into slavery in the city of Hierapolis around 50 AD. He had no legal rights, no guaranteed safety, and a master who reportedly broke his leg to demonstrate power. He could not control his circumstances, his body, or what was done to him, and yet he developed one of the most psychologically sophisticated understandings of human freedom ever articulated. It begins with a distinction so simple, It almost sounds like it cannot be the whole answer. Some things are within our power, some things are not. Within our power, our opinions, our intentions, our desires, our responses. Not within our power. Our bodies, our reputations, other people's feelings, other people's choices. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion with this exact division, not as a consolation for what we cannot have, as the foundation of every form of genuine freedom available to a human being. Because here is what you are actually doing when you chase someone's attention. You are attempting to control something that is categorically outside your control, not difficult to control, not requiring more skill to control. Categorically, structurally, fundamentally outside the domain of what any human being can actually govern. Another person's feelings are not yours to manage. Their choices are not yours to determine. Their decision to stay or leave, none of that belongs to the domain of your will. And when you place your stability inside that which you cannot govern, you have surrendered the only thing you actually possess, your own inner orientation. You are not suffering because you were not chosen. You are suffering because you assigned your peace to the outcome of a choice that was never yours to make. This sounds like resignation. If I cannot control whether they stay, then why try? But Epictetus was not advocating passivity. He was advocating precision. There is an enormous difference between genuine engagement, showing up fully, caring deeply, expressing honestly, and attempting to engineer another person's response through careful self-management. The first is within your power, the second never was. And the exhaustion you feel, that bone-deep exhaustion that comes not from doing too much but from trying to control too much, is the direct cost of consistently operating in the domain of the uncontrollable. What changes when this actually lands? Not just intellectually, but experientially. You stop spending energy on outcomes you cannot determine. Not because you do not care, but because you finally understand that your caring does not give you control, and the energy that was previously directed outward toward monitoring, adjusting, pursuing, becomes available for something else entirely. For the first time, you begin to direct it inward, toward the one domain where your attention actually produces results, toward the quality of your own thinking, the honesty of your own intentions, the stability of your own response to whatever unfolds. Epictetus called this the highest form of freedom, not the freedom to determine outcomes, the freedom to remain yourself regardless of outcomes, the subtle humiliation of needing someone to stay. No one talks about this part honestly. There is a specific kind of pain that comes not from rejection itself, but from what you become in the process of trying to prevent it. It does not announce itself. It accumulates slowly in small moments that you rationalize individually, but that form a pattern you eventually cannot ignore. You let a comment pass that you would have addressed 6 months ago. You adjust your availability to match what you sense they want. You hold back an honest reaction because the timing does not feel safe. You become gradually and almost imperceptibly a slightly smaller version of yourself, not through any single dramatic decision, through a series of tiny concessions, each one justified in the moment, each one chipping quietly away at the shape of who you actually are. And one day you notice it. You are present in this relationship, but not entirely. You are there, but you are also managing, and the part of you that is managing has slowly overtaken the part of you that is simply being. This is what the need to make someone stay actually costs. Not the energy of the effort, though that is real. The deeper cost is the abandonment of yourself that the effort requires. In order to keep someone who might leave, you must make yourself into whatever you believe will make them stay. And that process erodes the very thing that made you worth staying for in the first place. Your genuine presence, your actual perspective, your real self, unedited and offered honestly. There is a quiet humiliation in this that most people never name. Because humiliation implies something external, someone diminishing you. But this is self-administered. You are the one making the concessions. No one demanded it of you explicitly, and yet you offer it repeatedly because the alternative, being fully yourself and risking that they leave, feels more dangerous than the slow erosion of remaining. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 3, that a man should be upright, not kept upright. To be kept upright requires constant external support. To be upright requires only that you maintain your own orientation. When you compromise your dignity to keep someone present, you are not building a relationship. You are constructing a dependency, a dynamic in which your presence in their life is contingent on your continued willingness to be less than what you are. And here is what is most worth examining. It almost never works. Not because people are cruel, but because the version of you that erases itself is not more lovable. It is less interesting, less present, less real. The qualities that create genuine attraction, confidence, groundedness, the sense that someone knows who they are, cannot coexist with the posture of someone who is performing themselves into acceptability. You cannot be fully seen while hiding. You cannot be genuinely chosen while engineering your own presentation. Your brain was trained for this, and that's the problem. You did not choose this pattern. That is the first thing worth understanding clearly, not as an excuse, but as an accurate description of how it arrived. Before you had language, before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate your own responses, your nervous system was already learning, building models, constructing predictions, developing a set of working assumptions about the world that would guide your behavior for decades without ever asking your conscious permission. The brain of a young child is extraordinarily active, scanning the environment, identifying patterns, drawing conclusions about what produces safety and what produces threat. And in the relational environment, the most critical question the developing brain is trying to answer is this: what do I need to do to remain connected to the people I depend on? For a young child, connection is not a preference. It is a biological necessity. Disconnection from caregivers registers in the nervous system as a survival threat, so the brain watches. It learns which behaviors produce warmth and which produce withdrawal, which versions of you are met with presence and which are met with absence. And it adapts, brilliantly, efficiently, and completely automatically. If the environment rewarded compliance, your brain learned compliance. If love in your early environment was given more freely when you performed well, achieved, pleased, or stayed small, your brain built a direct neural association between those behaviors and safety, between those behaviors and belonging. That association did not disappear when you grew up. Neural pathways do not dissolve simply because the environment that created them no longer exists. They persist, they activate, and they drive behavior in adult contexts that have nothing structurally in common with the childhood situations that formed them, but that feel to the nervous system functionally identical. This is why intellectual understanding alone is rarely sufficient to change the pattern. You can know with full cognitive clarity that you do not need another person's approval to be valuable, and then someone you care about goes quiet for 24 hours, and something in your body responds as though you are 5 years old and the most important person in your world has turned away. That response is not a failure of willpower. It is a conditioned reflex. And treating it as a moral failing only adds self-criticism to an already activated nervous system, which makes the pattern worse, not better. The brain that learned to chase can learn something different, not by erasing what was built, but by building something new alongside it, something rooted not in fear of loss, but in a genuine experience of your own completeness. But before that becomes available, there is a moment of recognition that has to happen first. There's a specific realization that most people spend years approaching and then retreating from, because its implications are deeply disorienting. The realization that nothing was actually missing. The day you realize nothing was missing, and what external worth really costs. This is the moment that changes the architecture of everything that came before it. It does not arrive loudly. For most people, it comes quietly, in a moment of stillness when the usual noise has temporarily gone silent. When no one is pursuing you and you are not pursuing anyone. When the negotiations have paused and you find yourself unexpectedly simply present with yourself. And in that stillness, something surfaces that the motion had been covering. You are okay. Not okay in the sense of managing or surviving, okay in the sense of complete, not diminished by the absence of what you were chasing, not hollow without the validation you thought you required, simply present and intact, and if you stay with it long enough to have something close to whole. This is disorienting at first, because the entire operating system you have been running was built on the premise that something was missing. And if the incompleteness was not real, if it was constructed rather than actual, then a great deal of what you have been doing and enduring and sacrificing was organized around a false premise. The feeling of lack, that persistent background sense of not quite enough, was never a perception of an objective truth. It was a learned interpretation, built from specific experiences, from moments of rejection that got encoded as evidence of unworthiness, from caregivers who, without intending harm, communicated that certain parts of you required correction. You took all of that in. You processed it through the mind of a child who had no framework for understanding that the information might be wrong, and you built a story about yourself that had lack at its center, and then you spent years trying to fill a gap that the story invented. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 8, that you have the power to strip away many superfluous troubles that exist entirely in your own judgment. The suffering we carry is often not a response to reality, but to our interpretation of reality. And interpretations, unlike circumstances, are revisable. This is also where the illusion of external worth reveals itself most clearly. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in the known world. He had access to every form of external validation a human being could possess: fame, authority, wealth, the visible deference of millions. And yet his private meditations were not the writing of a man who felt secure in his external position. They were the writing of a man who understood that his external position had nothing to do with his actual worth. In Meditations, Book 2, he wrote that he should look within because within is the fountain of good, not a resource you need to locate externally, but a source already present, requiring not acquisition but excavation. When your sense of worth is tied to external fluctuations, you are not experiencing value. You are experiencing a variable that happens in favorable conditions to feel like value. The person who reaches the relationship, the achievement, the recognition they believed would finally make them feel enough, so often reports feeling the same as before, or worse. Not because they are ungrateful, but because the mechanism was wrong. External confirmation cannot produce internal stability. The moment you genuinely begin to locate your value differently, the moment you stop consulting the external world for the answer, something in your behavior begins to shift in ways you did not expect. When you stop reacting and stop needing to be chosen. There is a specific kind of power that most people never access, not because it is difficult to understand, but because it requires tolerating something the nervous system finds genuinely uncomfortable. The power of not responding. Not in the passive sense, not suppression or emotional shutdown, in the deliberate sense. The conscious, chosen pause between stimulus and response that changes the entire dynamic of how you move through your relationships. You have probably noticed the pull in the opposite direction. Someone does not respond to your message, and something in you wants to send another one. Not because you have something important to add, but because the silence feels like a verdict and you want to argue against it. Someone pulls back and something in you leans forward. These are not conscious decisions. They are reactions. Automatic outputs from a nervous system that has learned to treat relational uncertainty as a threat requiring immediate action. And every time you react automatically, every time you send the extra message, soften your position, fill the silence, you confirm to your own nervous system that the threat was real and the reaction was necessary. You train the system to be more sensitive, not less. Epictetus addressed this in the Discourses. He described the practice of restraining the impulse, holding back the assent. Between the external event and your response to it, there is a moment, a gap, and in that gap lives your actual freedom. Not the freedom to control what happens, but the freedom to choose what you do with what happens. The practice is learning to widen that gap, to insert a pause between the signal and the response, to notice that the anxiety is present without immediately acting on it. What happens in that pause is remarkable. Much of what feels like urgent emotional truth in the first moments after a trigger is not actually truth. It is prediction. Your nervous system is generating a forecast based on old data, based on what similar situations meant in the past, and presenting that forecast as current reality. When you pause, you give the forecast time to be tested against actual evidence, and very often the evidence does not confirm the prediction. The silence was not rejection, the shift in energy was not withdrawal. These were events, neutral in themselves. Your interpretation gave them meaning. This connects directly to the larger shift, from needing to be chosen to simply being available to be chosen. On the surface, these can look identical. You show up, you engage, you offer yourself honestly, you care about the outcome. But the internal experience is entirely different. When you need to be chosen, there is always a monitoring function running in the background, a part of you tracking responses, measuring temperature, evaluating signals. That monitoring function consumes significant attention and energy that is therefore not available for actual connection. When you no longer need to be chosen, when your inner stability does not depend on the result, something releases. The monitoring quiets. The part that was tracking and hoping becomes available for something simpler and more powerful, actual presence. The quality of your attention changes, and attention is not a small thing. Genuine, full, unself-conscious attention is one of the rarest and most compelling things one human being can offer another. People feel it, and people are drawn to it. This is the paradox the chasing pattern never allows you to discover. The pursuit, the need, the monitoring, the adjustment is precisely what prevents the connection it is trying to secure, and the release of the need is what makes connection genuinely possible. The truth that changes everything. Stop for a moment, not metaphorically. Actually pause with what is about to be said, because this is the point in the conversation where something either lands completely or gets processed intellectually and filed away without changing anything. Here it is. You were never being rejected. Not in the way you experienced it, not in the way that felt like evidence of your inadequacy, like confirmation that you were not enough. What was actually happening in those moments that registered as rejection, that your nervous system encoded as threat, that your mind used to construct a case against your own worth, was something far more neutral and far less personal. Incompatibility. The people who did not choose you, who pulled away, who went silent, who left, they were not rendering a verdict on your value. They were demonstrating an alignment problem, a structural mismatch between who they are, what they need, how they move through the world, kabika, and who you are. That is not rejection, that is information. But your mind did not receive it as information. Your mind received it as judgment. Because there was already a story in place, a story that said your worth was conditional, that belonging required performance, that love was something you earned. And every experience of misalignment got fed into that story as evidence. The story was not true, but it was old and deeply embedded, and it had been confirmed, or so it seemed, by enough subsequent experiences that questioning it felt like denying reality. Here is what is actually true. The version of you that was trying to make those relationships work, the one that was adjusting and performing and monitoring and pursuing, was not your most lovable self. It was your most anxious self. And your most anxious self is not the self that creates genuine connection. It creates the appearance of connection, while the actual distance remains or grows. The people who were not right for you could not have seen you clearly, even if they had wanted to, because you were not showing yourself clearly. You were showing them a managed, curated, performance-optimized version designed to produce a specific response. And when the response did not come, you interpreted the failure as evidence of your inadequacy rather than as evidence that the approach itself was structurally incapable of producing what you were looking for. You cannot be genuinely chosen while hiding. You cannot be truly seen while performing. This is the truth that changes everything, not because it is comforting. It is not immediately, but because it relocates the problem entirely. The question is no longer, why am I not enough? The question becomes, who am I actually when I am not performing for anyone? Epictetus wrote in the Discourses that every person should identify what kind of person they are and maintain it, in every situation, in every relationship, consistently and without apology, not as rigidity, as integrity, the alignment between your inner reality and your outer presentation. The relationships that did not work were not proof that you were unworkable. They were proof that those particular configurations did not fit. Water and fire do not align. That is not a judgment against either one. It is simply an accurate description of their relationship. The energy you spent trying to force the fit, trying to reshape yourself into something compatible with people who were fundamentally not aligned with who you actually are, that energy was not love. It was not commitment. It was anxiety wearing the costume of devotion. You stop chasing when you finally see yourself clearly. This is where it ends, and where everything actually begins. Not with a technique, not with a resolution or a decision or a set of practices to implement, with something quieter and more permanent than any of those things, with a shift in the quality of your own seeing, with the moment, not dramatic, not announced, when you look at yourself without the distortions that have been shaping the view for as long as you can remember, without the story of insufficiency, without the invisible contract that turned belonging into a performance, without the confusion between incompatibility and inadequacy, without the nervous system's ancient prediction that stillness is dangerous and pursuit is safety. Just you, seen clearly, as you actually are. And what you find there is not what the chasing implied you would find. You do not find the lack that the pursuit was organized around. You find something that was present the entire time, beneath the anxiety and the adjustment and the monitoring and the need. Something intact. This is not a comfortable realization. It would be easier if it were triumphant, but it does not feel like winning. It feels more like setting down a weight you forgot you were carrying, a relief that is quiet rather than exhilarating, a stillness that is not emptiness, but completeness. The Stoics pointed toward this not as a destination, but as a practice. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 7, that within yourself lies the obstacle and the clearing of it. Everything you needed to resolve the pattern was always inside the system. The clarity was always available. What obscured it was not external circumstances, but internal interpretation, the accumulated weight of beliefs formed before you had the capacity to evaluate them. Epictetus made the same point in the Enchiridion. He wrote that people are disturbed not by events, but by their opinions of events, and that the real work, the practical work, is not to change the events. It is to examine the opinions, to hold them up to honest scrutiny and ask whether they are actually serving the truth or simply repeating what was encoded long ago. When you do that work, genuinely, patiently, the opinions begin to change, not all at once, but progressively in the direction of accuracy. The distortions correct themselves. The story becomes less convincing. The gap between who you actually are and who the story told you that you were begins to close. And as it closes, the behavior changes. Not because you disciplined yourself into a new pattern, because the old pattern no longer has a convincing rationale. You stop chasing not by gripping harder against the impulse, but by removing the premise that made the impulse feel logical. You stop chasing when you no longer believe that what you are chasing contains something you do not already have. This is the practical meaning of Stoic self-sufficiency, not isolation, not indifference, not the performance of not needing anyone. Genuine sufficiency. The experiential knowledge that your worth is not contingent, your stability is not dependent on external confirmation, your completeness does not require another person's choice to become real. From that place, connection changes entirely. You still seek it, you still value it, you still invest in it and care about it, but you seek it from surplus rather than from lack. You offer yourself not as someone auditioning for belonging, but as someone who is already at home in themselves and genuinely interested in sharing that space with others. You become that, not through deciding to be that, through seeing yourself clearly enough that the performance becomes unnecessary, through understanding your own worth thoroughly enough that seeking external confirmation of it begins to feel redundant, through coming home to yourself, repeatedly and deliberately, until home is where you actually live. The question this video began with was, why do you chase? And the answer after all of this is precise. You chase because you believe the thing you are chasing contains proof of something about yourself, proof that you are valuable, proof that you are wanted, proof that the story of insufficiency was wrong. But external proof cannot settle an internal question. The question has to be answered from the inside, through the lived experience of being yourself, fully and without apology, and discovering that the world does not end, that you remain intact, that the silence does not destroy you, that the incompatibility was not your failure, that the lack was constructed, not actual, and that who you are, seen clearly without distortion, without the weight of the old story, is more than enough. It always was. The chasing ends not when you become something different. It ends when you finally recognize what was already there. And once you recognize it, truly, not just intellectually, you will not go back. Not because you have willpower, because you have clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, does not ask your permission to change everything. It simply does.